Hello, and welcome to the 67th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's pod is titled The Knock-on Power Shock, Gas, Electricity, and Europe's Pricing Trap. For the last few weeks, the headlines have stared at oil tankers, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Dutch TTF natural gas futures screen. Fair enough. That is where the latest energy shock first announced itself. But the underplayed consequence, and the one that lands straight in domestic politics, industrial margins, and project finance, is electricity. Europe and Britain still run power systems where gas can set the market price often enough to infect the whole stack. So even in a grid that is much cleaner than it was a few years ago, a gas shock still travels faster than bad news. The awkward truth is that the system is cleaner today, yet still exposed. We're going to present several energy use statistics, so fair warning, and in attempt to ease any tedium, we've rounded figures to the closest full percentage point. In 2024, renewables produced more than 48% of EU electricity, and nuclear more than 23%, leaving fossil generation below 30%, with gas at 16%. By 2025, the European Commission said clean energy had reached 70% of EU electricity, with wind and solar alone at 30%, ahead of fossil fuels at 26%. Britain tells a similar story in different proportions. Renewables supplied a record 53% of generation in 2025, yet gas still provided 32% and remained the largest single contributor. If the dearest gas plant is still the unit that clears the market in a large share of hours, every cheaper megawatt behind it gets dragged into the same drama. Elegant on a whiteboard, less charming on a household bill. The EU's Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, known as ACER, latest market monitoring makes the problem plain. Renewables supplied 50% of EU electricity in 2025, but gas-fired generation increasingly provided the evening flexibility and pushed wholesale prices upward, while daily wholesale price swings were about 5 times higher than in 2020. Europe also remains structurally dependent on imported gas. Eurostat put EU gas import dependence at 86% in 2024. After the winter 2025 drawdown, EU gas storage sat around 29% full on April 8th. And the Commission's Gas Coordination Group is already warning member states to refill to at least 80% by this upcoming November, while bracing for long-lasting market effects. That is a system which has moved forward on decarbonisation without fully escaping fuel price risk. The Middle East channel matters here even where the physical molecules do not all come straight into European sockets. The Commission said this week that about 9% of EU liquid natural gas imports, 7% of EU oil imports, and around 40% of EU jet fuel and diesel transit the Strait of Hormuz. Markets are reacting to shipping, insurance, outage risk, and the possibility that the ceasefire phrase again. Brent has rebounded toward $100 a barrel at the time of writing this pod, as doubts over the ceasefire resurfaced. Commodity shocks do not need to last forever to do damage. They only need to last long enough to catch a power system that still leans on gas at the margin. For consumers, the problem is that retail bills lag the wholesale shock and then refuse to fall as cleanly as politicians promise. Eurostat says the average EU household electricity price in the first half of 2025 was around 29 euro cents per kilowatt hour, still above pre-Ukraine war crisis levels. Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and Italy sat among the highest. Taxes and levies also grew as a share of the bill, rising from 25% to 28%, which helps explain why households keep hearing that markets have calmed down while the bill on the kitchen table continues to look mutinous. ACER makes the same point in plainer market language. Household gas and electricity prices remained high even when wholesale prices eased. Governments can see the trap already. In late March, the Commission said it was examining whether it might need to revive parts of the 2022 crisis toolkit, including cuts to grid tariffs and electricity taxes. 5 EU countries, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Austria, have asked Brussels to consider a new EU-wide windfall tax on energy firms. Giorgia Meloni, Italian Prime Minister, has gone further and floated the idea that if the crisis drags on, the EU may need to think about pausing budget rules again. That is where the politics get ugly. High power prices hit voters quickly, hit inflation next, and hit public finances right after that. The money leaves the household first and then turns up as a fiscal argument. Across the EU, the exposure is sharply uneven, which is exactly why the next few months will feel so politically lopsided. March analysis showed average wholesale electricity prices in 2026 were already up by at least 12% against 2025 in Hungary, Italy, and Romania, 3 economies with heavy gas exposure. Italy remains Europe's most gas-reliant large economy, with roughly 38% of its total energy supply coming from gas. Spain, Portugal, and France sit on a different part of the curve. Spain generated about 55% of its electricity from renewables in 2025, Portugal about 80%, and France combined roughly 70% nuclear with about 20% renewables. Their electricity prices so far this year have been dramatically lower than Italy's. The spread is the lesson. System design and generation mix decide who bleeds first. The strongest piece of evidence against fatalism comes from Spain. The Commission says fossil generation set the wholesale electricity price in Spain during just 19% of hours in the first half of 2025, down from 75% in the first half of 2019. That single metric tells you where the market should go. More renewables, more interconnection, more flexibility, and less dependence on gas as the marginal unit mean fewer hours when an international gas panic writes the power price for everyone else. Britain has its own version of the same headache. Ofgem, the UK utilities regulator, says wholesale gas costs account for around 40% of a typical household energy bill. Great Britain is a net gas importer. Around 47% of its gas arrives by pipeline from Norway, 29% from the North Sea, and only about 1% of LNG imports came from the Gulf in 2025. Direct Gulf dependence is limited, yet pricing exposure remains large. Ofgem says gas can set Great Britain's wholesale electricity price in a large majority of hours, because there still is not enough renewable generation and storage on the system. Cornwall Insight now expects the domestic price cap to rise around 18% in July, to roughly £1,929 a year from £1,641 in April. That is the knock-on effect in plain English. Britain can be lightly exposed to one supply route and still get smacked by the same price mechanism. And Britain has a second problem layered on top. The House of Commons Library says the January to March 2026 price cap remained 44% above the winter of 2021 to 2022. It also notes that UK domestic electricity prices in the first half of 2025 were higher than every EU country except Germany, even while UK gas prices were below the EU average. The ratio between electricity and gas unit prices in the UK was the highest in Europe. So Britain enters this fresh gas-linked shock carrying a power pricing structure that already looks punitive. When ministers say families need resilience, households are entitled to ask why resilience always seems to involve them paying the first instalment. Retail pass-through is messy because caps, hedges, standing charges, network investment, taxes and policy costs all move on different clocks. Ofgem's current cap actually contains a £66 annual increase from network costs tied to new investment, while some policy costs were shifted into general taxation. In the EU, the tax share of household bills has been rising again. That means governments face a miserable trade-off. Leave the bill alone and absorb the political anger. Cut taxes or subsidise tariffs and absorb the fiscal damage. Reach for windfall taxes and risk frightening investment if the mechanism is sloppy. There is no elegant way through a price shock in a system that still lets gas clear the market so often. Industry feels this earlier than households because there is less political cushioning. The International Energy Agency says electricity prices for energy-intensive industries in the EU stayed above 2 times US levels and nearly 50% above China in 2025. Inside Europe, the spread is brutal. Eurostat's first half 2025 non-household electricity prices ran from around 27 euro cents per kilowatt hour in Ireland to 8 in Finland. EU wholesale electricity averaged about $95 per megawatt hour thus far in 2026. The British government has effectively admitted the competitiveness problem by promising that more than 7,000 firms will see electricity bills cut by up to 25% from 2027, while expanding network charge discounts for the most exposed manufacturers. You do not launch support on that scale unless the underlying price structure is already grinding investment decisions. For project development, the commercial implications are immediate. Any business case built around large grid power demand, data centers, electrolyzers, battery supply chains, advanced manufacturing, green fuels, district heat, must take a view on where marginal electricity prices go next. In the UK government's recent call for evidence on corporate power purchase agreements, data centres are explicitly cited as major electricity consumers, and the consultation flags credit requirements and contract complexity as barriers to wider uptake. Developers are trying to finance into a market where the clean asset may be cheap, but the surrounding system can still behave expensively and erratically. That gap between asset economics and system economics is where a lot of good projects lose time, margin, and nerve. This is why PPAs matter more in this pod than they do in today's lazy, talking point-driven political discourse. The Commission says PPAs typically run for 10 to 20 years, give industry price stability decoupled from gas volatility, and provide the revenue certainty developers need to invest. Brussels and the European Investment Bank have already launched a €500 million pilot for PPA counter-guarantees, and the Commission says Spain and Germany together account for at least a quarter of all European PPAs. ACER is now consulting on what would deepen the market, from state-backed guarantees to platforms and tax incentives, because the availability and functioning of PPAs still vary widely across the EU. In a gas-linked shock, a well-structured PPA stops looking like procurement fashion and starts looking like strategic shelter. That said, let us keep one foot on the ground. PPAs are powerful and they are no magic trick. A beautifully priced solar or wind PPA does not rescue a project if the connection date floats away into the mist, or if the contract structure leaves the buyer carrying too much mismatch risk. We would push much harder for market reforms that make standardized, financeable PPA structures easier to sign, especially for mid-sized industrials, and the new wave of heavy electricity demand. The market needs more boring, bankable repetition. Boring is good when you are financing infrastructure. Now, to the zero-sum argument, because it keeps turning up like bad weather, the public conversation is too often framed as a choice between accelerating fossil fuel development versus accelerating sustainable power. That framing collapses on contact with how electricity is priced. New fossil fuel sites take years to develop, feed into internationally traded fuel markets, and leave power prices exposed to the same commodity logic that created the problem in the first place. Clean generation, storage, interconnection, and demand flexibility work through a different channel. They reduce the number of hours when gas is on the margin. Spain's shift in price-setting hours gives the game away, and Ofgem makes the same point from a British angle when it says gas could fall to setting the power price only around 30% of the time by 2030, if Britain adds more renewables and storage. The fatal flaw in the zero-sum story is simple. It mistakes fuel volume for price security. The cost case for sustainable electricity is now painfully clear. The International Renewable Energy Agency, aka IRENA, says 91% of newly commissioned utility-scale renewable power projects in 2024 produced electricity more cheaply than the cheapest new fossil alternative. Utility-scale solar came in around 41% cheaper than the lowest-cost fossil option, and onshore wind around 53% cheaper, with global average levelized costs of about 4 and 3 US cents per kilowatt-hour respectively. That does not mean every project is easy, or every market is well run, or every connection queue is sane. It does mean the core generation economics have moved. The cleaner route now has the stronger power cost case. Clinging to volatile gas and hoping geopolitics behaves itself is the riskier bet. Good luck with that. The lesson for Europe and the UK is to build the full stack faster. More wind and solar, yes. Also, more storage, faster grid reinforcement, quicker connections, more interconnection, smarter demand response, better contracting tools, and a market design that stops treating gas as the author of every difficult hour. ACER is clear that gas plants are increasingly used for evening flexibility. Ofgem is clear that Britain can cut the share of hours in which gas sets the power price by adding more renewables and storage. IRENA is clear that enabling technologies such as batteries, digitalization, and hybrid systems are now central to turning cheap renewable generation into a resilient power system. Add those pieces together, and the strategic direction becomes obvious. So where does this leave consumers, governments, and developers as the current shock rolls through? Consumers are going to keep feeling the lagged pain. Governments are going to keep scrambling between subsidies, tax cuts, windfall levies, and arguments over fiscal rules. Industry is going to keep demanding durable price relief rather than another tour of emergency sticking plaster. Developers and off-takers who can lock in long-term clean power will be in a much stronger position than those left floating against gas-linked wholesale markets. For Synergy International, the deeper point is blunt. Europe has spent years increasing clean electricity supply and has still not gone far enough to break the pricing power of gas. Calling this a knock-on effect understates the point. Electricity is the channel through which a fuel shock becomes an economic shock. Until that mechanism is weakened, the next geopolitical tremor will keep arriving with the same grim punchline attached to the power bill. Well, that's a wrap on our 67th GreenWave podcast episode. We truly appreciate you spending your time to listen and learn from the pod. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please leave us a 5-star review if you like what we are building. You can also keep up with Synergy International on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, and at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.